Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Casualties of War, Reading Science Denial and Racism's Impact on African American Children. We're very glad to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to the insights of our speaker, Kareem Weaver. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, CORE, the Consortium on Reaching Excellence in Education. CORE's mission is to improve instructional practices so that all students receive the high-quality, equitable instruction they need in order to succeed. Rest assured, you will get a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck. Those materials will be sent to your email tomorrow, and they'll also be posted on the CORE website, which is corelearn.com. So I think we're ready to get started now, and I am very pleased to welcome our speaker, Kareem Weaver. Kareem is an extremely busy man. In addition to supporting the Honors Pathway program, which helps quadruple college graduation rates for vulnerable students, he serves as commission chair for the Oakland Alliance of Black Educators and is a member of the Oakland branch of the NAACP's Education Committee, leading their literacy initiative. In all of his work, his primary goal is to advocate for a quality education for all children, regardless of background and circumstances. Kareem started his career in South Carolina as an educator in orphanages, group homes, and juvenile justice centers. He then became a teacher and administrator in the Oakland Unified School District, where he helped create a culture of learning and growth for both adults and students. He's since served as a trainer of teachers, principals, and leadership teams, emphasizing the importance of change management in connection to the communities being served. We're honored and excited to have Kareem here with us today to dive into the many factors that impact success for African American students and how the reading science wars in particular have resulted in poor outcomes for many students across the country. So Kareem, are you ready to get us started?
I'm ready. Thank you, Emily. I appreciate you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's jump right into it. I like to begin presentations with the end in mind. And I want to start with this quote from the American Federation of Teachers, which really captures the essence of this presentation and what we want everyone to know. It's straightforward and should give hope to every child, parent, teacher, principal, and community, and even employers. With the new research, actually, but even more importantly to being new, is the fact that we finally have both scientific and research consensus about how to get kids reading. Over 90% of all kids, including many that are now classified as learning disabled, can read well with intensive early instruction delivered by skilled educators. So you've got to give AFT credit for their willingness to stand on the science and research, because, you know, to say all kids can learn without hedging in this charged social, political, racial environment and actually mean it says a lot about their worldview. The fact is, we're a long way from having all kids, but a handful, be able to read well. And in those situations, under duress, we find out what we truly believe. So this data is stressful. There's no doubt about it. But AFT, in this example, is choosing to ground its belief in the research and the science. So they can responsibly make that statement because they understand and can even list the elements of an effective reading program. So these pillars of early literacy that you see in front of you, the phonemic awareness, the phonics, the comprehension, the vocabulary, and the fluency, most of the so-called reading wars were about narrow views on these pillars. We need all of them to be given, consistent time and to be given consistent attention in regular core classroom instruction. But just as important is the phrase explicit, systematic core classroom instruction. So what we at the NAACP are saying is, and we appreciate CORE for providing this platform, is that racism needs oxygen. And having explicit, systematic instruction in the core classroom cuts off the supply of oxygen by limiting some common tendencies. When we take things step by step, from the beginning in a systematic way, we avoid assumptions about where kids should start or what they're capable of. We'll talk more about this later, but it reduces the impact of adult learners' biases, keeps us from discriminating intentionally or not, and considering all the variables that impact student learning. It's even more important to limit the impact of those things by starting at the beginning and just walking through the standards. So, and of course, this also includes a strong writing component. But as you see these elements listed here, the most effective curricula, meaning that these curricula actually, help the highest percentage of kids become strong readers, in a well-matched, with a well-matched curriculum that fits the context of the school and the community. But these curricula embed these elements. It includes a strong writing component, but it also has these things. And some popular programs actually now that have been in use around the country are starting to adjust to include all these pillars. But that last item, I just want to take a moment to look at that last item. It's high quality PD is really important. You really can't expect teachers to know what they haven't been taught. And frankly, the same goes for administrators who are supposed to help teachers grow by giving them feedback. High quality PD is critical to an effective reading program. And you might hear, these elements called evidence-based or research-based practices or scientifically based reading practices. There's lots of different, acronyms that we use for these things and taglines for these things. But today, let's just use the shorthand of structured literacy to describe what we're talking about. And actually, the reason that's important is because, it turns out that most kids actually require a structured approach. This infographic really synthesizes the research well. It's embedded in that statement by AFT is the word if. So yeah, over 90% of kids can learn and read well if we leveraged a structured approach that included all those elements. The challenges we face are so consuming. The conditions and dangers that we can see are real, from the distractions of the reading wars that emphasize, one pillar over another, to conditions that make it hard for parents just to maintain, for teachers to teach, to make it hard for students to learn. The impact of these things on our students, families, and schools are really difficult to measure, but it often does produce stress and crises. So AFT, again, they're providing perspective with which the NAACP agrees, regardless of the politics of it all. We have to understand that parents want us to start with three things: keep the kids safe, teach them how to read, and get them college and career ready. There are other important things, don't get me wrong, but it starts there. And if we can't do that, of course, there will be various reactions, both internal and external. So yes, these things are challenges, and we see them. But what's missing is the reality that there are also things we cannot see, things that lie beneath the surface. And today we want to touch on some of these things and even get into the deeper waters, if you will. So let's start with racism and reading science denial. There are a lot of definitions of racism, but we're going to use one created by Dr. Audrey Smedley at VCU. It's helpful here in our context because it focuses on practices and beliefs. She says that racism is essentially when we act like there's a causal link between physical inheritance and intellect. So a popular societal belief is that, kids are born smart, they're born kind of smart, maybe kind of dumb, and dumb. Now that's a popular belief. It's not often articulated, but it's there. And so the credit in that context, and even more so the blame for student outcomes, is at least partly assigned to this, to what they're inheriting. So if one has that view, you're unlikely to construct, or you're likely to construct an archetype for success and for failure. And it's likely that archetype is centered on race, but also leverages other characteristics to interpret reality. So this slide shows you that in 2019, none of these groups scored advanced in reading. None. None even scored proficient, actually. So an objective view of this data would be that our system is struggling. And then we go about looking for root causes and see how we can make shifts. A racialized view, on the other hand, would be to attribute failure to the inherent qualities and circumstances of particular groups, to the degree that we see neither the larger systemic failure nor the ways in which our expectations and views impact that targeted group. Essentially, what it says is that, across all the demographic areas, traditional public, charter, city, rural, western, northwestern, northeastern, southern, the racial demographics, white, black, Asian Pacific Islanders, Latino, those who are on free and reduced lunch, those who are not on free and reduced lunch, all those groups, none of them are proficient, none. And so given that, objectively speaking, we can't really target one group or another unless we have a racialized lens in which we're looking at the data. So moving on, there is a researcher by the name of John Hattie that, he did a meta-study. Matter of fact, if you could go ahead to the next slide. He did a meta-study on the research, if you will. And he wanted to find out what worked in education. One second, make sure we're on the same page here.
Yeah, I think this is the one we need to be on.
Yeah, that's it. So in Hattie's meta-study, basically it's research on the research. And they wanted to find out what worked. So their data set includes over 300 million students and identified effect sizes or impact over 250 different things. How big a difference do these things make on student learning? Teacher estimates of achievement had the biggest impact, with 4 times the impact of the average influencer. It turns out that what we estimate a child is capable of impacts nearly every choice we make in our schools. This is the expectancy effect. And so when we talk about racism and reading science denial in comparison to what we showed earlier, whichever we leverage more allows us to overcome the other. It's kind of like, the old story of the 2 wolves. Both can, each can dominate the other. It just depends upon which one you feed. Well, science versus racism, research consensus versus low expectations, whichever one we feed. The second biggest influencer was teachers' collective efficacy. Now, I've listed some things here just to give you a sense of the comparison, but I'm going to actually let Hattie explain what collective efficacy means.
The new number one in visible learning is teachers' collective efficacy. And on the one hand, that's exciting because it confirms the story. On the other hand, it's a bit of an unfortunate title. It kind of implies that having efficacy, having confidence, having all the teachers in the school believing they can make a difference, it's actually more than that. Now, to have a meta-analysis, you have to have lots of studies. This is not a new idea. This has been around a long time. But it's just that Rachel Ells was the one that pulled it all together to show what its combined effect was. And the message I want to get across, it is teachers working together to have appropriately high, challenging expectations of what a year's growth for a year's input looks like, fed with the evidence of impact. And that's what sustains it. It isn't just growth mindset, it's not just rah-rah thinking, it's not just, we can make a difference, but it's that combined belief that it's us that causes learning. It's not the students from particular social backgrounds, it's not all the barriers out there. Because when you fundamentally believe you can make the difference, and then you feed it with the evidence you are, that is dramatically powerful.
All right.
Thank you. So let's just take a step back for a second. 12 years after integration, the U.S. government produces a study to show how things are going in schools. And in fact, the phrase achievement gap originally related to the findings of that Coleman report, which is what it became known as. So as we explore race and the impact on African American children, we must be mindful of the various worldviews. In the Coleman report, a worldview was introduced that says schools really can't have much impact on student outcomes. And the conflicts with the view between that and what's popularized by AFT, the science, and the research consensus that believes students can achieve, they can learn to read, regardless of their background. When certain elements are present, like strong curriculum, instructional materials, lines of research, etc., all of those things, it creates a tension, if you will. All those things bolster the worldview on the right, while the Coleman report bolsters the worldview on the left. And it's up to us which one of these we feed the most within our classrooms, our schools and systems. This is the clash of views that must be grappled with at the institutional and the individual level. As for the reading science, well, let's just say a picture's worth 1,000 words. The image on the left is a functional MRI of a non-reading kindergartner who has not been exposed to letter, speech, sound correspondences. It clearly shows the inability to activate the language centers of the left side of the brain. And without the ability to sound out words, the brain is basically stumped. Contrast that versus the image on the right. It's also a non-reading kindergartner after exposure to letter, speech, and sound correspondences. The lit up areas represent blood flow. So this image and others, similar images that tackle other reading skills, provide demonstrable proof of which part of the brain needs to be activated in order for kids to sound out words or derive meaning. Now, the good news is that after being provided with effective reading instruction, the language parts of the brains of struggling readers can almost always be activated. So let's just take that for a second and then move on to dyslexia and adult learner's bias. The Shawitzes, who are foremost experts in the field of dyslexia, their expertise has been leveraged into screeners, into books, etc. What they suggest, or what they say, is that dyslexia can be, it's very challenging for people who struggle with literacy, but it takes many forms. They say it can be dysgraphia for writers or dyscalculia in math, but it's related to neurology. It's how the brain works. So you might wonder what their definition has to do with race. Well, it centers on expectation, the relationship between how students are learning and what we expect them to do, given our perception of their cognitive ability and the effectiveness of the instruction we are providing.
You just simply define dyslexia.
Dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty in reading in an individual who has the intelligence to read at a much higher level.
In 1983, they began tracking the reading of more than 400 kindergartners picked at random. They're still tracking them today.
And what we found was that 1 in 5 were dyslexic.
1 in 5?
1 in 5.
I would have thought maybe 1 in 20.
Well, that's what the dogma was. But now it's clear that it is very common.
But perhaps their most important finding, there is no link at all between dyslexia and intelligence.
The biggest misunderstanding is that people who read slowly aren't smart.
IQ is on the top and reading is on the bottom. And
The
you can see
Shawitzes
that
compared
IQ
typical readers whose reading skills mirror their IQs with dyslexic readers whose reading skills don't. It's not just that it's low, it's that the gap gets wider as the years go on.
They don't connect. One doesn't influence the other.
But today, medical scans clearly show it's in the brain.
In typical readers, certain areas in the left side of the brain are typically activated. In dyslexic readers, there's an inefficient functioning of those systems that we now know are for skilled.
So, given what we know about expectations, it's really important to use more objective markers. That keeps us from letting our views on race and other dynamics influence how and when we perceive reading struggles, which will then determine the speed at which appropriate interventions are applied. We recently shared this definition of dyslexia, that it was really a gap between a person's intelligence the reading ability. We shared, and a grandmother in the community yelled out, "That's everybody." Literally, she said her worldview was that kids can learn, and so she perceived it to be, obvious. But dyslexia is actually a neurobiological condition. It's in the brain. What the grandmother has to understand is that when we don't provide kids with effective instruction, using a structured literacy approach, for example, the kid may appear to have dyslexia. So the looks and sounds very similar. But again, one is a neurobiological learning difference, while the other is a difference where we just haven't given the brain what it needs. The child is in an unfortunate, the child is an unfortunate casualty, really, of the reading wars. But in terms of how it impacts the lives of the kids and the families and the communities, as we say in my community, it's the same difference. And you might wonder why we all aren't using a structured literacy approach. I mean, at this point, very few people, given the amount of evidence, would still suggest that we don't need all 5 of those pillars. Even curriculum publishers, like I said, are going back and reworking things, adding supplemental pieces to cover their bases. I mean, we can discuss at a different time, the approach, the Band-Aid approach to fixing curriculum that's already in circulation versus starting with something that was designed from the very beginning to be whole. But still, why is there such dissonance with this? The Oakland NAACP, as part of our focus on reading, has really worked to understand this. And we've come to realize that the perceptions listed here are widespread. So when you think about structured literacy, you can see those that are listed. These narratives are common. There was a time when only 40% of students really needed to be good readers to fuel our economy. But in this age, this information age that we're living in, everything's changed. It's a whole new dynamic. The need is different. And so a huge elephant in the room is the impact of expectations on student achievement, which is what Hattie was alluding to, and how American integration occurred without adequately addressing our societal views of students, what they can learn, and the impact that we as adults can have. So 2 quick notes. We find the idea, or the common refrain, is that there is no singular approach. We take that to be a red herring, because that statement misses the point that public education should be afforded to all. What's more accurate to say is there's no single approach needed for about 40% of the students. So structured literacy isn't always important, not for that group. However, we need to be clear about the goal. If the goal is to support the highest percentage of students, then we need to apply what we know. As for structured literacy pushing out the high-income families, here's a news flash. Wealthy parents have kids that struggle to read too. However, what the school does not do, the parents provide. They get the tutors, the aides, the medical specialists, the educational lawyers to get kids what they need. So in many ways, our achievement gap is a function of, different communities' financial capacity to deal with the impact of what is and isn't being provided to their children in school. And then the perception that these non-readers are bottom dwellers or ne'er-do-wells. They have to, educators would have to teach to the lowest kid or dumb things down, or that this is something only for poor Black students. It's just false. It really is. This hits everybody, which is what that slide will show you when you look at it later on when we send it out to you. It hits everybody the same. In fact, to counter that narrative, here's a list of, good old-fashioned white male dyslexics. Why white men, you say? Because, we need to shift the thinking about who needs this. Dyslexia specifically, and low reading in general, is not a sign of low intelligence. In fact, dyslexia is actually affectionately called the MIT disease, because so many MIT researchers have it. They're only 20% of the population, but they're 43% of the self-made millionaires. and over 50% of your NAACP sites. But they're also overrepresented in our prison population, where up to 80% of the inmates are functionally illiterate, and a majority of those are dyslexic. So they can go either way. But by unquestioningly accepting the dogma of the day, we're feeding the wrong wolf, so to speak, and failing to develop our most gifted students, or those who are gifted in a different way. We're squandering their genius, and we're jeopardizing the fiscal health of our institutions by sending kids to special ed who shouldn't be there. Structured literacy in the core classroom and combined with early screening for dyslexia allows us to intervene much sooner. It helps us to provide the level of text complexity necessary for students to become college and career ready. We have to identify the root cause and intervene in a timely way, not use poor student outcomes to give oxygen to unhealthy views about students and what they're capable of. There are figurative wolves, so to speak, around our practices and beliefs that are like landmines. They're always there. So I'm just going to take you through a few of them. Here are some examples. The belief that we shouldn't be teaching reading too soon. Teaching phonics or phonemic awareness too soon, the thinking goes, counters the development of listening skills and play and the love of reading. Look, there's nothing wrong with play, nothing wrong with listening. But hopefully you begin to identify the unfortunate possible impact of that kind of view. Or, for example, here's another one: we don't need to prioritize early intervention, or we don't need to make sure they have structured literacy as core instruction in K-3, or our district doesn't need to do a universal screener for dyslexia. It costs too much. Let me say, we got it under control. Another wolf white might be, that brain science is really not that important. There's too much emphasis on it, or you could say, on those MRIs. But hopefully we become more mindful of the practices and beliefs that align with a non-racist view of our students. And, we should appreciate and even affirm, groups like AFT, who've been standing against the narrative forces of discrimination, inequity, exclusion that have been around since integration. They've been standing contrary to the prevailing winds within the sector. That's what social justice is, to be able to stand for something even when it's not popular in an educational context. So part of what the Oakland NAACP's work through its educational committee has been to engage with universities, to understand what's being taught to not just teachers, but also to principals and administrators, and identify any institutions that are willing to teach to mastery. We found there's a wide variety of philosophy and approach for universities. All provide instruction in some of the 5 elements with varying levels of emphasis. We know that educators have expressed a hunger and desire to understand the brain science. We hear it all the time. They want to understand the foundational skills, and they want to understand the important literacy shifts, like, for example, text complexity, that were laid out in the most recent updated college and career readiness standards. K-12 system leaders want to know that the educators they hire can teach a child to read, or they can support the teacher's growth in that area. And they really want to know if they have to spend money helping them unlearn practices and beliefs that aren't aligned with their worldview on students. Our work continues in this area, in the teacher prep in the university area. So let's shift to adult learners' bias. So our NAACP surveys have found that an overwhelming majority of educators and nonprofit service providers learn to read in a way that fits within the first 2 categories you see here. 5% that learned that, learning to read was just effortless. And then the other 35% or so that could learn to read with broad instruction. Their needs are met. And because language and reading are closely tied to identity, we become connected to whatever helped shape us. Whatever reading experience we had, that often becomes the center of the conversation and the advocacy. But the challenge with this lack of diversity is those first two groups, their own experience can become an echo chamber where it's hard for them to imagine, let alone embrace what others might need. So these groups that are designated to teach and serve the community are populated by the beneficiaries of the current system, which is often misaligned with the community's needs. Further, this learner's bias, it really doesn't leave much room to explain the struggles and successes of others who need something different. Instead, we often try to make sense of this challenge using, our views on race, class, gender, and a variety of other dynamics, and what we were taught, frankly. So rather than turning to the brain science and the research consensus on, effective reading instruction and look at our own practices or questioning what we've been taught, we tend to believe student challenges are rooted along a continuum that falls somewhere between, unmitigable environmental factors and inherent traits. You may have heard the old African American saying, you got to be twice as good to get half as far. It's rooted in stats like these that you see here on the slide. So let's quickly move to adult identity and vulnerability. So my identity as an educator is really centered on wearing the white hat, so to speak. And you can go ahead to the next slide. My title depends in my positionality within an organization, in my confidence that I know what I'm doing, and the respect that's all part of my identity, especially the fact that, as most educators believe, we're forces for good in the world. But there's some vulnerabilities that really have to be unearthed, because if you're going to grow, the challenge of adjusting midstream like this is, first of all, I've just spent 20 years, anywhere from 1 to 20 years or 30 years or 40 years doing one thing. Did I just waste my time? And then there's a new learning curve. What about my credibility and the trust that exists between a teacher and a principal and a community, a teacher and whomever? It's all is a web of trust. And then in an organizational sense, are we liable? If we've been doing something that hasn't really been working, are we responsible or liable for the outcomes? Well, in this next slide, what I also find is the biggest challenges lie here. Yes, those vulnerabilities are big. Yes, the need for courage is there, and the identity issues are there, but it's the doing of it. There are many, many wonderful initiatives that are sitting on shelves. They just are. They're bogged down between whatever the conflict is of the day, whatever adult issues are, or the politics of things. But it's the doing of it. It is not just one person in one room or one grade level, but as an entire school, an entire community, making sure that, for 3, 4, 5 years in a row, especially in those formative years, kids are getting what they need. Not just for their foundation, but then all the way up, they're getting the text complexity. That takes some doing. That's a challenge in education for a whole variety of reasons. And so schools and communities of educators really have to come together around what's in the best interest in the broader group, the largest number of students, and then the preparation to change, the change management that has to happen. And then there's the X factor. There's some things, we've listed many things that are below the waterline, but then there's some things that you really can't quantify. And I think we've got enough time. We only have a couple of slides left, so I think I am going to ask you, Emily, to cue up that short slide here. For those of you who get this later, there's 2 links here. The top one is a longer version, about 15 minutes, but then this bottom one here is worth listening to. This is Marva Collins, one of the foremost educators in our country. She passed away not too recently, and her schools in Chicago were popularized, in the 80s and the 90s because they used systematic instruction. And I want you to listen not just for, the phonemic awareness, the vocabulary, and all those other things, but what's the X factor that's missing that neither, AFT, the research consensus, or I in this presentation have laid out yet? What are the things that the sign that glues it all together.
16 years ago, we broadcast a story about Marva Collins, a Chicago teacher who started her own elementary school on the city's west side Prep. Marva claimed that with love, hard work, and no-nonsense teaching, inner-city children could compete with anyone academically. It was, to many people, quite an inspiring story. But not to Charles Murray, author of the controversial book about race and intelligence called The Bell Curve. On page 399, Murray writes that Marva's celebrated anecdotes about her students are too good to be true. We traced 33 of the 34 and flew a group of them back to Chicago, back to West Side Prep's new location for a reunion of sorts.
Aren't you pretty?
To see if Charles Murray's allegations in the Bell Curve are true, to see whether or not these young men and women lived up to Marva's claims. Christopher Stubblefield,
We learned to read hard work.
the 8-year-old with the big voice, is now at university in Texas, and Erica McCoy Pace graduated last spring from Norfolk State University. When you saw her last, she was listing her favorite authors.
Emerson, Henry David Thoreau.
And what about the rest of our class of 79?
Michael Anderson, Taylor.
Terry Holmes, owner-operator of transportation company.
Latanya Singleton, preschool teacher.
James Lowe, Staff Sergeant, United States Air Force.
Sabrina Yates, 6th grade teacher.
Rysel Winters, law student.
Louis Johnson, operations manager.
Xavier Jones, teacher, criminal justice major. Craig Brunner, clerk for the state's attorney's office.
She just gave so much to me personally in terms of always being reassuring. I mean, just the small things, like she would grab my face and say, pretty girl.
You're brilliant.
Yeah.
Honey, you're brilliant.
That's right.
Yeah, especially Craig. She would take his head and raise it up. Speak up, honey, you're brilliant.
That's right.
And, you know, after someone telling you that
Every day.
every day, 5 days a week, for 3 or 4 years, you know, that's in you. That becomes a part of you. You are brilliant, honey.
And then when we were doing Shakespeare, we put on the plays, and we had the three witches right there with the witch. Yeah, it was fun.
But Charles Murray stated that claims of long-term academic achievement would typically fade as these children grow up.
Sagacious means what? Means you're very what? Bright.
The words that we learned, it was nice because when we left and we heard someone talking, using a word, we knew what that word meant. And now in school, a lot of times we get the reading list on the course outline. I've read most of the books on there. You know, it's like, oh yeah, I read that, or the teacher will be talking about something, and I'm like, oh yeah, I read that book. All the students may feel like this.
Murray also raised questions about Marva's claims that 5- and 10-year-olds who'd been labeled unteachable were capable of reading Chaucer and Shakespeare. Well, Michael Anderson was said to have a learning disability when he entered Marva's school at age 9.
I had a client just a couple months ago, brought up Shakespeare out of nowhere. And we sat after having coffee for 3 hours. You know? Well, what did you learn Shakespeare? 4th grade. I knocked him off his feet. He couldn't believe it. 4th grade?
And there is Erica, who was considered a hopeless case at age 6.
Basically, I was told that I was borderline retarded, that I would never read. So I was basically written off.
I was supposed to be put back a couple of grades, but I wasn't when I came to Miss Collins.
When we saw Craig Brunner in 1979, he was reading his essay about Cleopatra.
Very, very long ago, there was a queen called...
What was the secret of her success, of motivation, or what?
That confidence, how you have a brain, you can do it on your own. You don't have to wait for anybody.
She killed herself with a poisonous snake.
Very, very true.
I say to every child, for example, Morley, there's no one with your eyes. There's no one with your nose. There's no one with your hair. That makes you really special. Look, there is nothing wrong with you. You just have not been taught. I don't want you to get this, I'm dumb, I'm stupid. There is nothing wrong with you. You are somebody because God didn't make any junk. All right? My last name. That's all right. If you can't forget your last name, don't worry about it. Just calm down. We're here to help you.
Okay.
These days, her message and methods are repeated by teachers she's trained for her 3 elementary schools in Chicago. She is mostly on the road, giving seminars for teachers all over the country. Above all, she tells them every child is teachable. Every child can learn.
Ask the slowest children in your class how many children know the rap songs, and they all raise their hands, and I'll say them for me. And I says, good. If you can do that, you can learn the Canterbury Tales in Old English, too. I don't know half of what those rap songs are saying, but they know every line. What makes us think, then, that they become such learning disabilities when they get to school?
Of those not at the reunion, a number, like Brian Gurley, are still in college. Most of the rest are working. Michael Singleton is a Chicago police officer. 2 others are corrections officers. Darius Daniels is the office manager of an insurance agency. 2 others are salesmen. Michael Ridley is a buyer in the restaurant business. Felisa Felder graduated from Loyola and works for a large brokerage house in Chicago. This January, she enters Loyola Law School.
Where do you expect to be 10 years from now?
10 years from now, judge.
A law professor, actually. I said that I wanted my master's by 25, and I'm going to have my master's by 25, and then I'm going to be sitting in law school.
I would plan to be working with the Nation of Islam as far as dealing with agriculture and agribusiness.
You're studying agriculture now?
Yes.
I am going to have my own line of clothes. Not, I hope to. I am going to have my own line of clothes.
Married with my family, working hard in my church, and I'm opening my school. It's going to be very similar to this one.
And Erica Pace, she wants to open a long-term homeless shelter. Erica, once described as retarded, graduated from college last May, summa cum laude.
That X factor, you know, you can't, there's no policy or legislation or curriculum that's going to teach love. That's something that binds everything else together. But I showed that clip because, and you can move forward to the next slide. We only have a couple of them left. I showed that clip because, you know, the belief that a structured approach, which she used, those elements were in her classroom. You can go back one. That they are mutually exclusive with high expectations and with a rich, approach to literature. That's just not true. So to wrap this up, the NAACP advocates for a few things. Some of you may know, as part of the criminal justice reform, President Trump signed the First Step Act. And it's aimed to reduce recidivism. And what it says is that incoming inmates or new inmates into the federal prison system will be screened for dyslexia and then provided the supports they need to get their GED. It does a lot of other things too, but that's a good thing. The challenge with that, from our view, is it's got to be funded, fully funded, and it has to be monitored. But we also don't think our kids should have to wait to go to federal prison to get what they need. So among the other things you see here, we need to have a reckoning with K-12 reading instruction. Yes, we need screening and support at the early grades. Yes, we need educator prep programs to reflect the needs of the communities. And yes, it should be done with the parent-community partnerships. But we have to have a reckoning, and not a blaming, but a simple agreement to move together and forget the past, or acknowledge the past, I should say. Both the impact, our best intentions. You know, when you know better, you do better, and just move forward together. And now that last piece, I just say that, you know, it's a lot to read. But essentially what it says is we're asking everyone to remember that the outcomes we're getting are a product of a system. You don't have to be a racist, for example, to produce outcomes like this. Well-meaning people who themselves learned a certain way, or were trained a certain way, and are not supported through the change management process, really have to be courageous and reflective to choose a different path. So it's our position that, with the student outcomes like we've been getting, to ignore the research in brain science, preferencing our own learners' bias or the current dogma, is a violation of students' civil rights. And the interpretation of these predictable results that we've gotten says more about us than it actually says about the kids. So look, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I appreciate your hanging with us. Emily, thank you so much for your support. The Oakland NAACP is really moving this work forward, having passed a state dyslexia resolution. We're just so grateful for the opportunity to present and share. There's some contact information there if you'd like to get more information. And Emily, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kareem. This was definitely a sobering topic, but it highlights what we need to do to support African American students as well as every student in our classrooms. We just need to do it, and you really mapped things out well for us. So thank you very much. Before we get to the questions that have been sent in, I would like to thank our sponsor, CORE, again. CORE is dedicated to helping educators build their instructional skills so that they can provide the type of high-quality research-based instruction that Kareem shared was so critical as part of the equation of helping students succeed. So while CORE's professional learning services do encompass reading, writing, and math, I would like to call your attention to an online course that CORE offers that teaches the fundamentals of effective reading instruction, and Kareem went over those 5 pillars at the beginning of the presentation. And this 10-week course, the Online Elementary Reading Academy, we've got a new session starting February 27th. I encourage you to learn more about it at corelearn.com, and you can also take a look at the other professional learning services that CORE offers. So now let's go ahead and take some questions. Kareem, I'm going to go back to your slide just so folks have got that nice picture and also have your contact information there. So one question I think to start off with is, could you maybe give a definition really about what the reading war is? We had some folks just questioning what that is and wanting to understand that a little bit better.
Okay, in the 90s, there were 80s and 90s. There were questions about what's the best way for kids to learn, and there were various camps. Those who professed to support a whole language method. Those who thought phonics was the best way. They emphasized different pillars, basically, and they fought over their pillars, as opposed to saying all these things were important and writing, and we've got to figure that out. Instead, they went tribal. It reflects kind of like our politics today, the tribalism. So the federal government then commissioned a study in '97. It came out in 2000, I believe. And they said, go figure it out. Tell us what we need to do to teach kids to read. They came back with a report, and it listed these 5 pillars. They consulted the research. They brought the experts together. They came up with these 5 pillars. And then the research since then has, validated and confirmed that. But the war itself was a distracting battle between these camps, the different curriculum and program and training methods, et cetera. Meanwhile, while they stood in their camps, the kids weren't learning a doggone thing. Well, that's my own spin. The kids weren't learning to read at the level they needed to read, and that still persists today. Some of those camps have morphed, into other issues, into other programs with different names, but it's rooted in the same basis as some of those early participants in the reading wars.
Okay, great, thank you. And this question sort of aligns with that. It's really around the marketing of various reading programs and products. How do we help educators be better consumers of these products and, choose options that really align with those 5 pillars and what's been proven to be needed in order to teach all children to read?
So I'll give you something for parents and then something for schools and system leaders. So for parents, there are tons of resources, especially for those who've been homeschooling their students, going back to Robert Fleisch's book about why Johnny can't read, and then 25 years later, why Johnny still can't read. Those books are great resources. For schools, publishers can tell you anything. One of the reasons structural literacy is also called evidence-based instruction is because you ask for evidence. Has this worked? If I do this, will 90% of the kids be on track to read? And if they balk at that, if they, if they're not willing to say, if you do this, and of course you mix in the love, the kids will grow, the kids will read. But I'd say is you got to look for those elements to be woven in consistently not just as a strategy, but as a method of instruction. You also need a scope and sequence at the system level that is skill-based. So that way you can provide educators with the professional respect they deserve and the flexibility to expand on things that may be in the curriculum, as long as you get to the certain place at a certain time and the kids have shown mastery over certain skills, we're good. So that's what I'd say. I'd say you can look at a group like edreports.org where they, assess the various curriculum of the day. Although those things have to be updated on a regular basis, there are people that support with analyzing curriculum, but you're looking to see if those elements are there, if they're there consistently, if they're embedded into the fabric of the routines and the systems of a curriculum. And the other thing is, and this isn't often talked about, in order for something to be effective, it's got to work for that group. So every school is different. Every community is different. There are curriculums that fit different folks. Maybe it's because of the bandwidth issue. Maybe there's high teacher turnover, or maybe people have a lot of experience and they were around before these reading wars, and so they remember certain things that aren't taught in grad schools today. Those are the things you also have to consider when choosing a curriculum. Is not a one-size-fits-all. There are some good new curriculum out there. I don't think we're going to endorse any particular curriculum here. You can email me, I can give you some references. But you're looking for those elements to be present, and it has to lead towards using text complexity up and down the curricular alignment, up and down the content level. So whether it's science or math, et cetera, that you have invested enough in that domain of knowledge that so that kids can access text complexity and be on the road to college and career readiness.
Okay, and again, Kareem's email address is there on the screen, so if you do want to reach out, feel free. And I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So this is in line with what we just talked about, but so over and over, this attendee encounters teachers who think that they are using evidence-based approaches, yet the curriculum they teach relies heavily on strategies like 3Qing. There's little openness to investigating, let alone using structured literacy. And here's the question. How does change happen given how deeply entrenched methods and mindsets are that aren't working?
That's a great question. Great question. That's been our work with the NAACP, especially since it's around identity. Change happens in two ways. So first of all, from a community perspective, you have to leverage the community. You have to leverage the parents and say, look, enough is enough. In California, we've got 75% of Black boys that can't read. At a certain point in time, you have to ask, what's the goal? That usually opens the conversation up some. I've met with leaders of organizations around the city, around the region, and I always say, if everything you're doing works out, if the class sizes are reduced and the salaries increase as leadership in school systems, and if this is that, and there are all the buy-ins there, if you're doing what you're doing, what will the reading proficiency rates be? And I've heard anything from 40% to 55%, which is sobering. So to tell them, listen, there's science out here that can get us to 90% and higher. We're going to need you to make some shifts. It takes community pressure and engagement and support. It takes a commitment to providing teachers with the resources. It takes good leadership. Change management is a leadership skill. And so you have to have principals who are head teachers. They can't lead something they don't know about. They've got to get the professional development. They've got to be willing to support their teachers, and they've got to be able to create an environment and a culture of vulnerability where people aren't going to be blamed for doing what they've been taught to do, what they've been directed to do, and what they've been evaluated on doing. Instead, they're willing to reflect, look at the outcomes, and make some shifts.
Thank you. I think that was a good note to end on, and I'm sorry we don't have more time together to take questions, but this has been a wonderful hour. It's certainly been informative for me, and I think for everyone in our audience as well. So thank you again, Kareem, for taking the time to be with us and sharing all of this. And folks, thank you for taking time out of your very busy days to learn more about this topic, and it's great to know there's so many passionate people out there who are wanting to deal with these issues and address them head on. So thanks very much. Just a reminder, again, you will get a copy of the slide deck and the recording. We'll be sending those out tomorrow by email. Sometimes those emails do end up in junk folders, so if you don't get it, head out to corelearn.com and you'll find the recording posted on the website. I hope you'll also join us February 13th for our next webinar featuring Dr. Michelle Hosp. She's going to focus on assessment and intervention specifically for students with dyslexia and other reading difficulties, which, as we learned from Kareem today, is a critical component of supporting our students. So we'll include a link to February's webinar in the email you'll receive tomorrow. And one last thing, before you log off from the webinar today, you'll be prompted to take a short feedback survey. We'd really appreciate your answering the 5 questions that come up and just letting us know your thoughts about today's program, as well as any suggestions you have for additional topics that you'd like to have professional learning webinars centered around. We are actually going to start planning our fall webinar schedule here in the next little bit, so your suggestions are definitely welcome. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you very much, Kareem. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the country.